War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 16, Terrorism. If ever a subject on war required a working definition, it is this one. And if ever a subject on war will never find a universally agreed upon definition, it's also this one. Returning to our instruments of national power, dime, diplomacy, information, military, and economic, we can also think of these instruments as levers, seeking to maximize force across all four in those areas where you are strongest against where your enemy is weakest or his center of gravity. Terrorism, generally speaking, places its fulcrum on the I, information. It is a strategy, and we'll focus on the strategic and above levels of war in this episode, taken by those who are far weaker on the other three instruments. It is, like nuclear deterrence, focused primarily not on the violent act itself, but on the implied threat of further violent acts in the future. So with these caveats, let's move forward with my preferred definition of terrorism, with full understanding that this definition will be rejected by many. Terrorism is violence, or the threat of violence, directed against protected targets in pursuit of policy objectives. It seems simple enough, so let's tear that down. Violence itself, while a seemingly clear-cut concept, has recently gotten a little hazy. While sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me was long a schoolyard mantra and appeared to be as good a defining line of what constitutes violence. Some have started claiming that some words or statements constitute violence absent physical force. And if that isn't problematic enough, many on the extremely educated side have also included silence as yet another form of violence. We must, however, for the sake of clarity and argument, reject these oh-so-modern expansions of the word and return to Webster's circa 1972, which states simply, and in my opinion accurately, a use of physical force so as to damage or injure. As for threats, they must be legitimate. A 6-year-old child stating, "I will kill you," is not to be taken seriously and does not give you free rein to defend yourself with force. Assuming you are not 6 years old as well. However, a 6-year-old holding a gun is a whole different scenario. To the terrorists' credit, their threat of force almost, but not always, precedes the actual use of force. This is sometimes because the terrorist organization started as a failed political organization. The implied weakness of the terrorist often leads the targets of this violence to dismiss the threats. Again and again, you see the victims of terrorism surprised that those who had threatened them with violence actually acted with violence. To simply assume that those who wish to hurt you cannot do so is a luxury for the civilian, but not the military professional. So to those who wish to threaten violence for political gain, without the actual desire or ability to carry through with that violence, be forewarned if someone takes you seriously. In the words of a good friend, all in works every time, until the last time. And now we delve into what is probably the most contentious aspect of the definition: what constitutes a protected target? As we learned in episode 5, protected targets can be persons, places, or things. But keep in mind that the law of war is almost entirely defined in the context of what is known as peer or symmetrical warfare. Uniformed combatants led by acknowledged commanders from a recognized nation-state. And while these entities can engage in terrorism, it is generally not the strategy of the nation-state in the envisioned scenarios and historical experiences that built the modern Geneva Conventions. Civilians are, of course, protected persons. But again, as previously noted, a civilian engaging in armed hostilities is still a criminal and can be targeted, although, generally speaking, only in immediate combat. But what if a soldier not actively engaged in immediate combat? If in uniform and in an area where combat is ongoing, of course. You should have kept better security, you dumbass. In uniform, but not in an active combat area? Well, I don't know. A U.S. soldier stationed in Korea but attacked by a Taliban fighter prior to our humiliating surrender in 2021 is assumed in this hypothetical scenario, of course. As the Taliban fighter would be in civilian clothes, it would certainly be a criminal act. But terrorism? I would say no. The fact the soldier is, at that moment, not engaged in active hostilities is notwithstanding, as that soldier could be engaged in active hostilities in the future. If that future is near or far is simply a matter of degrees, not principled definition. This example brings us to an incredibly important point about terrorism. Terrorism is a war crime, but not all war crimes are terrorism. Terrorism is a very specific type of war crime that constitutes a strategy with a range of tactics and operational considerations, all supporting a policy, and refreshingly, almost always a cohesive, simple, and seemingly obtainable grand strategy. It is a deliberate war crime, justified by those who engage in it entirely by an ideological construct, which, in the view of the terrorist organization, necessitates a departure from internationally agreed upon norms of conduct. You will note that I state terrorist organization. Lone wolves do exist and can conduct terrorism, but they will invariably affiliate with a larger ideological concept, even if that ideology rejects the individual at the time. Ted Kaczynski is a fascinating case study into the Venn diagram crossing terrorism, crime, and insanity to perhaps be discussed in a later episode. But I yet again digress. To bring us back to our example of the soldier in Korea targeted by the Taliban. What if the soldier was in civilian clothes? If the Taliban could positively identify, otherwise known as PID, and a critical term that will be expanded upon in a forthcoming episode on operational terms, the individual as a soldier of an army actively engaging the Taliban, even thousands of miles away, then that too would not constitute terrorism, because that individual would not be a protected target simply because of the wear of civilian clothes at that time. But it would remain a war crime because the Taliban would not be wearing a uniform either. This brings us back to the current conflict in Gaza. The targeting of individuals in civilian clothes, even unarmed, is not inherently a crime and certainly not terrorism, if PID can be established that they are indeed combatants and engaged by forces otherwise adhering to the internationally defined norms and laws of warfare. But let's expand this a bit more. Where do politicians fall on the spectrum of combatants? I will use the American example as this presupposes multiple layers and a fading of what we would hope is a clear demarcation. The president is explicitly the commander-in-chief. He directs not just policy, but has authority over all levels of warfare. Even though he wears no uniform, he would not, in my opinion, be a protected person by the law of warfare. A president visiting Afghanistan or Iraq and being targeted and killed would not be a victim of a terrorist act. It might be a war crime, but not terrorism. To clean up a currently popular saying, F around and find out. Please note, I am not advocating for any violence against any president, past, present, or future. Rather, this is a discussion of my technical definition of terrorism in an academic sense alone. So I beg of you, don't shoot my dog. But what of Congress? Congress declares war. They direct policy against the enemy. But Congress is not something one can target. Congress is a concept. Congressmen and the U.S. Capitol are the physical manifestations of this concept. And here my definition shows cracks. And as such, I'll defer my opinion on the subject until after we clean up the final part of my definition of terrorism for political purposes. While I generally disdain the conflation of the terms policy, politics, and political, it works for our purposes in this definition. The act of terrorism demands the desire on the part of the terrorist to enact a political change of the target's nation. I use the word nation as a default to the Westphalian norms we continue to somewhat operate with. I would concede that an act of violence against the UN, whether its building or people affiliated with it, would also constitute terrorism. In order to coerce a change in policy, the organization must have the means to enact policy that, in theory, affects the terrorist organization, or at least its founding principles. A homeowners association enacts policy for the members and, in theory, violence against it would be construed as terrorism, albeit one would hope the violence would be at a level so low as to be laughable in any other context, perhaps leaving dog poop on the lawn of the HOA president. But you have other civilian organizations wielding immense power and at times exceeding that of other nation states. You could target an OPEC member nation state seeking to change OPEC policy, or the World Economic Forum. Any organization which has the power to enact policy affecting others would be a target of terrorism technically defined, accepting, of course, that terrorism is, in fact, a war crime. This brings us to some subsets of terrorism that, by themselves, are not inherently terrorism, but can use terrorist tactics. You have treason, which is the support of another nation to which you are not a citizen against the nation to which you are a citizen. If you do so with the support of that foreign nation, this would be state-sponsored terrorism. You then have insurrection, which is the desire for a political change in your own nation, not necessarily in support of a foreign entity, but certainly outside the legal political process. In a functioning democracy, violent insurrection would be exceedingly difficult, as the political change demanded would necessitate, almost by definition, the support of a majority of the nation, which, if the cause had that already, there would be no need for violence or insurrection, as it would simply be a legal political change assuming, of course, the proper functioning of government. The Battle of Athens in my home state of Tennessee being an interesting case study of how insurrection does arguably become legitimate when the democratic process fails. At the time, the Battle of Athens would be defined as terrorism. It was certainly violence against protected persons in pursuit of a political objective. However, the political objective being the restoration of previously agreed upon rights, it was, in hindsight, the manifestation of Locke's appeal to heaven, after all other recourses had failed. Outside the Geneva Convention, are those who seek to usurp constitutional rights protected persons? That is for jury and history to determine. This focus on democracies brings up perhaps the key point in discussing the strategy of terrorism. The violence against protected targets must have the objective of policy changes. If you are dealing with an oligarchy or despot, targeting protected individuals or buildings does not have the ability to change policy. And if the targets can directly affect the policy of the despot or oligarchs, then one must question if they are protected in the grand sense, if not the technical sense. Threatening or enacting violence against a population, when that population has no power to change policy, fails the terrorism test. It then becomes either mindless violence, back to Sun Tzu, the noise before defeat, or disproportionate violence. To the example of the firebombing of Dresden in World War II, the Allies did not think that killing tens of thousands of German civilians would cause Hitler to change his policy and end the war. Rather, it was, at best, the attrition of the ability to produce and transport war supplies at the operational level. Was the violence against protective civilians proportional to the operational and tactical benefits derived? I would argue not. But that would, in my opinion, make it a war crime, not terrorism. So to the earlier conundrum of the hypothetical targeting of congressmen, if Congress accurately reflects the will of the people they represent, then targeting those representatives is, in fact, an act of terrorism. If the policy of the nation is so onerous, but you lack the instruments of national power to change them, I guess this leaves you with terrorism. And let there be no doubt whatsoever, terrorism works. Sometimes. In fact, rarely. But the chance of success can be worth it to the ideologue committed to an absolute ideology, which demands total domination in pursuit of an often utopian and ethereal objective. In the Cold War, communist nations often embarked upon a policy of state-sponsored terrorism. They created a logical and moral construct which first assumed that world peace was both the highest possible good as well as only obtainable under a one-world communist government. Therefore, any act taken in support of this objective, regardless how violent, served the interest of peace and was, therefore, legally permissible and morally right. Conversely, any action taken to subvert the establishment of the communist utopia, no matter how peaceful, was inherently violent and immoral. Back to our silence is violence construct, which we rejected at the outset of this episode. It was within this construct that communists developed the trite and fundamentally wrong saying, "One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter." It is not the cause to which you fight which defines your acts as terrorism. It is the acts themselves which do so. And when violence is waged against the innocent, whether for politics or personal gain, it is a crime, even if you get away with it. So what did you think of my definition of terrorism? If you didn't like it, how would you define it? With that being said, I would like to publicly thank my subscribers who pay my hosting fees: Paul, Dave, Jeffrey, and William. My sincere thanks. A more specific plea to those who listen regularly to take the time and recommend this podcast to others. I'm not going to lie, regular listeners are looking pretty flat. And please join me with all your friends next week when we delve into the arguable origin of the nation-state, the 30-Year War, and the treaties of Westphalia. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.